My guest on this one is a really, really cool guy, and I really enjoyed talking to him. He wrote a book recently, which we discussed, and I really appreciated how open and honest he was about all the aspects of that book, which was his life story as a refugee who fled the Vietnam War with his family and grew up in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Please welcome Phuc Tran.
All right, we're good. Thanks for joining me tonight.
Hey, Jake, how are you?
I want to make sure I do this right because this is a point that's mentioned in your book. The Americanized version of your name, which you adopted, is pronounced Phuc.
Correct.
That's not actually how you pronounce your name.
It is not. Well, not in Vietnamese.
How would one pronounce it correctly?
In Vietnamese?
Yes.
Phuc.
Okay. And now, which do you prefer these days?
Since I'm not around anyone Vietnamese, like ever, like Phuc is great. Like that's the name that's the name I respond to. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So we'll go with that.
Yeah. Thanks for asking.
Of course. No, it's an important point of the book.
Yeah. Yeah.
So normally when I'm talking to someone who's just written a book, I would ask them where the idea came from, what prompted them to do it. In your case, though, this is your life story.
Yeah, but it wasn't like a story that I shared a lot. You know, it's funny. I was actually talking to a collegiate alum, and he said, "I didn't know anything. I didn't know any of this about you because you never talked about it." And it was totally true. You know, like it just wasn't like the refugee experience and like the experience of growing up in a small town as a refugee. Just it didn't seem like anybody was interested in it. And frankly, it was just like it felt so crazy to me that like I wasn't even able to articulate it. And then in 2012, I gave a TEDx talk at a friend's encouragement. And that's when I just thought, like if this is my last chance to really talk publicly, about my story, like I might as well swing for the fences. And so, in that talk, I just thought, well, I'm just going to talk about all the things that I love. I'm going to talk about grammar and linguistics and the refugee experience and punk rock and like 80s culture, and I don't know what else, Star Wars, in 12 minutes, right? That seems really feasible. And that was really what planted the seed. Like the reception to that talk was really positive. And so I thought, well, like maybe someday I might write a memoir, and yeah, here we are.
It's funny because grammar, when you say that you're going to give a TED talk about grammar, I feel like to a lot of people, they think, oh my God, that subject I hated in high school and I still don't really know today and I've forgotten everything. So how did that come about? How did you decide to do it about grammar, and how did you pitch that to the people who put it on?
Yeah, I mean, I think they just, it was just like it was just something I was thinking about at the time. Like I think I was on a flight and I had like 6 hours, and I brought my laptop and I just sort of started free writing, like just brainstorming, and there was a nugget to that came out, and I was just I was literally writing about a conversation that I had with my dad, and I was studying ancient Greek at the time in college, and I was trying to explain to my dad the idea of the subjunctive, and he was just like, that's stupid. Like, and then that sort of, the whole idea of framing the talk around the differences between English and Vietnamese sort of came out of that.
For people who don't know their grammar that well or don't remember, because it's funny, I actually had to explain to native English speakers what the subjunctive is. I feel like it's something that's kind of dead in English. It's not really taught as much. And I had the benefit, like you did, of knowing classics. So that was kind of how I learned what it was in English. Even going to a good high school, I didn't really know that. So for people who don't really know that as well, or remember as well, how would you explain the subjunctive, the indicative, and then I guess the lack thereof in Vietnamese? Because I think that, to me at least, that was very striking.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I mean, this is so straight out of like Dr. Russell and Dr. Keller's playbook, right? Yeah, the subjunctive and the indicative, and then also the imperative are verbal moods, right? So they're not tenses, they're moods, and a mood is defined as like the speaker's attitude towards the statement, right? So the indicative mood is the factual mood, so meaning that whatever you're saying, you view your statement as fact. So if you say like, I am hungry, right? That's a verb in the indicative mood because you're viewing it as fact. In the subjunctive is the mood used for hypothetical, right? So it expresses like potentiality, possibility, or contrafactuality, right? If I were hungry, right? Or I might be hungry. So, and just to clarify, Vietnamese does have some version of the subjunctive, but it's really weak and it's not used a lot, like for the sake of the TED Talk, like I had to boil down the ideas a little bit to simplify them for, sort of stark antithesis, but Vietnamese doesn't use it as much and it's not as nimble as English, right? So like in English, you have like these sort of fine nuances of I might help you, I could help you, I would help you. Whereas like Vietnamese doesn't have any of those distinctions. And then once you get into sort of like contrafactual ideas, like if something had happened, then we would have done this. It's just like, they're just like, ugh, like they don't even bother. Yeah.
Why do you think that is? Is there an etymological reason for that?
I don't know. It's a good question. I mean, I think that they just found other ways to express that kind of stuff, or, I think about like when my grandmother complains about something, like instead of saying like, I wish that you had done X, Y, and Z, she'll say, why did you blah, right? So instead of saying like, I wish you'd brought an umbrella, right? She will say something like, why did you wear that shirt when you knew it was going to rain, or something like that. So, you're sort of complaining about the same thing, but it's framed around what did happen instead of what could have happened, if that makes any sense. And there's no rhyme or reason to it. I think language is inherently, illogical and unpredictable sometimes. And so, there's lots of sort of strange things like that. I mean, it's like French, like why doesn't French have the word for 84, or 80, right? Like, yeah, I don't know if you've studied French, but so like, their word for 80 is like, what is it? 20 times 4 or something like that. Like it's like 4 20s. Yeah. It's like crazy. I don't know. French.
So this seemingly, I think to a lot of people, a seemingly minor linguistic difference or linguistic background difference, in your case, obviously, as you get into the talk, made a huge difference in kind of your life and attitude and outlook, and your father's.
Yeah. I mean, I think the idea that like you can fixate on, sort of like should have, would have, and could have, right, is really, I mean, it can be like a space where you can be incredibly empowered, right, and unencumbered, and then it can also be like a black hole that you can fall down into, right? I mean, where people just sort of sit around and think about regret all the time and wishing that things had been different, whereas my parents, I think like they're only facing like the stark reality of things. And so I posit that I think that is somehow responsible, or that plays some part in, it's hard to say, what are all the factors that come into someone's resilience, but I think that's certainly part of their resilience, is their ability to sort of face things head on and not, sort of get trapped in sort of this linguistic loop of like, I wish things had been different, or, if only that had happened, and all that kind of stuff.
Your parents' resilience is actually basically the beginning of your book. You wrote this book, Saigon, which is obviously, it's a pun.
Yeah, which not everybody gets. I think not to call my editor out on it, but I think like 6 months into the book, she sent me this email. She's like, "I just got the title of your book." Like, yeah. So
Well, I'm proud that I got it then. So as your book begins, it's your life story. Your book begins with you and your family. At this point, you were 2 years old. Is that right, or a little bit under? You fled the Vietnam War.
Yep. Yeah. And so my grandparents worked for the U.S. Embassy. It was 1975. And, in like this like sort of magnanimous sort of humanitarian gesture, like Gerald Ford, decided that they had to evacuate all Vietnamese collaborators, because if they didn't, they would have just been dragged into a ditch and shot probably, right, by the, sort of invading communist army. So, yes, my grandparents got to leave. I can't imagine how heartbreaking, it was for them to pick 12 people from like a huge family and be like, okay, you're like the 12 people who get to come with us, and everybody, stay behind. Good luck, change your clothes. Like, I don't, it's crazy. But so my parents and I and my great grandmother fled with my grandparents. So like my great grandmother was like 80 something. It's crazy. But yeah.
Your family landed so by way of a few different stops, you came to Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and that's the city you referenced earlier.
Yeah, that's right. So there were 4 relocation camps that were set up in 1975 for Vietnamese refugees, and then as part of there was a federal government policy at the time called the Refugee Dispersion policy, I think it was called, which basically, dictated that they didn't want Vietnamese people to form ethnic enclaves. So they just wanted them to be separated from each other as much as possible, and just because they thought that would expedite their language acquisition and sort of acculturation. And so, yeah, we were sponsored by these nice Lutherans who lived in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and we moved there. And and we were like the only Vietnamese family in the town for a long time. And other Vietnamese families would come and then they would disappear. Like they would leave after a year and go to like Philly or Northern Virginia or something. But for whatever reason, my parents they stuck it out there for a long time.
That sounds like a really challenging policy, though. So when you got there, your parents spoke almost no English or almost no English?
No, they spoke no English. Yeah,
none at all.
Yeah.
And so, no, your parents spoke no English. You came with other relatives. Your father had been a lawyer in Vietnam and lost all of that. Obviously, his law degree didn't become practicable in the United States. And so, what were the first couple years like that you can remember? What are your earliest memories of Carlisle?
Yeah, I mean, I remember like my dad got a job. His very first job was driving a cement mixer, like for a construction company. And then my mom was like peeling apples in like an orchard, like just manual labor stuff. And then my dad like went to night school to learn English. And then I think he ended up actually even getting his GED. I mean, like much later on, like he went and got like 2 associates. I mean, he's like an academic at heart, I mean, he went to law school. So, but it's kind of like, when you're 25, like you come here, you got 2 kids and, it's like, how much time do you have to, sort of allocate to, anything other than surviving. Right. So he picked up English pretty quickly. My mom less so. Like my mom's English has never been great and it's, still not great. But, he's, fully fluent and, would read books. I mean, he was like, constantly. I mean, he's like the original like DIY guy, like he would go to he went and got a library card and like just check books out and like just was reading. And, so I think, in some ways, like I think he really believes in the American dream, like that meritocracy, the idea of like, just pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, which is like a funny phrase that, doesn't actually mean anything, but, he was just like, yeah, I think, I was told by people that if I just work hard enough, like I can achieve my dreams. And I think he does believe that still, that has happened for him. And it's inspiring to talk to him for sure. I mean, he certainly has blind spots about that, but I mean, I think he feels like our family and he himself are examples of, the opportunity that, or opportunities that can present themselves in America, for somebody who came here at 25 and doesn't speak any English, and you can own a home and have a job and send your kids to college and all that.
That juxtaposition, though, the difference between your father's experience as someone who came at 25, having abandoned what seems like it would have been a successful career, losing family members, and really knowing what he had lost, feeling that loss more than you or your brother because you were both so young. The juxtaposition between his faith in the American dream that you described and then the experience that you had, basically from your earliest memories, from the first places you went to school, kind of feeling acutely that you were an outsider and that you were different from everybody, and other people letting you know that in no uncertain terms. The juxtaposition between those two things is pretty striking.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, and it's a little bit of this like funny, you're familiar with like Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
A little bit, yeah, the hierarchy of needs.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and I feel like, for him, like, he was so happy to just not be dead, like, and to have like a roof over his head and his job, so like, I think in some ways, like it is a natural space for me to grow up in where I have all of the things at sort of the bottom of that hierarchy or the bottom of the pyramid. And so, like at the end, like, if you look at the pyramid, like, because it's usually how it's presented, like at the very top, right, it's like a sense of belonging and a sense of community, right? And like Maslow posits that like all of those internal things, are acquired once you have sort of like the most basic biological things. And so for my parents, like being refugees and being in survival mode, like I think they were just like, we need a house and, and a job and food and not die. Like, and that was at the bottom. And and it was hard for them to sort of transition out of that in some ways. And so, when I'm complaining to them about like kids bullying me, they were just like, whatever, like, like get over yourself. So I think that was, one of many small tragedies that happen, right? It's the disconnect, right, between like that first and second generation, or the first and the 1.5 generation. That I wasn't born here, but for all intents and purposes, like I grew up here. So, yeah.
Did you how early do you remember kind of knowing that you were not the same as your classmates, or how early do you remember kind of starting to feel that? Because your book, the subtitle of your book, I have it in front of me, is A Misfits Memoir of Great Books, Punk Rock, and the Fight to Fit In. And the former two, punk rock and great books, became things you discovered and adopted later and became cornerstones of your identity. But those two were part of the third, your fight to fit in. And that happened much later. So how early do you remember the fight to fit in starting?
Oh, I mean, I think like right from the get-go, I mean, like, I think you were just aware that like, either kids are ostracizing you, or you're just aware that you don't look like your classmates, or even if you think that you look like your classmates, at some point, like somebody will point out, like, I mean, I think like kindergarten, first grade, like kids are, I think, I can't remember the first time a kid called me a gook. It was pretty early on though, and I didn't even know what it meant. I think it was second grade. I was like, what's that? And then I was like, okay, I guess like I'm gonna have to fight you now. Like it's just, I mean, I think kids are just, kids can be assholes, right? And so I think it was, and I think when you look around at your classmates, and you're like, wait, why isn't anyone else getting called a gook, right? Like you're just like, oh, okay, I get it. Like it's because like I'm not from here, like because like that is apparently like a thing that you hate people because they're not from here, like it's, or being told to go back to your country, like that was
That's
pretty,
a common one.
Yeah, classic, right? Love that one.
Yeah.
It's just like, again, like I don't know what, it's like I don't know what to say to that, I mean, and again, like I think now that I'm older and maybe a little bit wiser, like I'm more curious about the place from which people say that, like I'm secure enough in myself now where it's like not crushing, and like I'm just like whatever, like that says so much more about you. And I'm really curious about it. Like I just don't know what would possess somebody to tell a random ass stranger on the street to go back to their country. It's just very strange, I mean, and you hear it all the time in New York too, right? I mean, like, or depending, maybe not on the Upper West Side, but
you hear a lot of things in New York.
Yeah, you hear it all in New York. I mean, like you really, yeah, for sure.
One of my friends is fond of saying that this is one of the only places you can get away with. That moment when it's your light and you're a pedestrian, you're walking, and someone stops a little too short in front of you, and you slam the hood of their car. One of my friends loves to talk about how that's what makes New York for him, that you can do that, and that's kind of, no one bats an eye at it on the street when you see it.
Yeah. I think Trevor Noah has a whole joke bit about that too, right? Yeah.
It's an unusual move, to say the least, but
yeah.
Sometimes. And
for sure.
See, an interesting contrast to that was, I believe you were 7 or 8 maybe, and you were in the grocery store with your parents, and a guy who revealed himself to be a veteran asked you guys where you were from, right? And you described, even at that young age, you described expecting what was going to come next, which was go back to your country or some kind of slur or something bad or derogatory in front of your whole family. And
yeah.
What he said to you instead was, I was there, beautiful country. Really, I think he said something like, really a shame what happened there.
Yep.
What did you make of that? Or what do you make of it now, looking back at it? Because it's kind of an amazing moment.
Yeah. And I still, and it happens a lot. I don't get as much, or I don't get like go back to your country as much, but like I think like in when my wife and I were first dating, she's like a white woman from Maine, and I said, like when I meet people and they're vets, like they'll always like there's like a story there, and she's like, really, like, and I think she believed me. She just had never seen it, and like if you ask her now, we've been married for 19 years. She's like, yeah, she could probably tell you. I don't even remember those stories anymore. Like it happens so much, but I'm sure she like, it's, a new experience for her. So like when she and I are like renting an Airbnb, and like the guy who's renting it is like a vet, and like he'll come up and like, he'll be like, oh, like, and he'll always say like, where are you from? And I'll say like, oh, I grew up in Pennsylvania. And he's like,
where you
your hair? Yeah. Where are you really from? And I'll be like, I was born in Saigon. He's like, oh, I knew it, and then he's like really excited. And then he's like, oh, I served in Nam. And I was like, okay. And then, I mean, I think, I think that, thinking about that specific anecdote, I think that there's something there for that vet that he needed to process, and he wasn't at a place yet where he could really process it, and maybe he didn't have a support group, or he hadn't discovered, counseling or therapy yet. And that's all he could say. And maybe seeing us there was a little bit triggering for him. So, I mean, hard for me to really surmise or step into his shoes and guess what, what sort of trauma he's, nursing or dealing with. I was just frankly so surprised that it wasn't like a hostile interaction, that it had more depth to it and sort of mystery than I was expecting.
Is it possible, as a reader of your book, I almost took it as a weird moment of connection, kind of like this bridging of a gap between two people who not should be, but, in theory, like you had experienced by that point, you'd experienced racism, you'd experienced people telling you to go back to your country. And yet here's this guy who would have more reason than any random 7-year-old in your town. Like I said, not that he would have a reason, but, you could, the trauma you're talking about, that at least logically you can understand a little bit. Whereas what actually, to me, it seemed like a weird moment of connection, almost common humanity.
Absolutely. And I think, and I would say 9 times out of 10, like that's still that is the basis of any vet talking to me. That happened a ton when I worked when I was in high school, and I worked at the gas station, like all the time. Like, people come in, they're pumping gas, and then, there's a guy and he's like a vet, and, I think they just want to connect, because I think it's, I think they're looking for some way to heal by talking about the experience, right? And I'm, shout out to mental health and shout out to counseling, right? It's just like self-care is healthcare. Like, I think, and in the 80s, like counseling and therapy were, I think, relatively still pretty stigmatized, hopefully it's less so now. But so I think like those old dudes were just like looking for a way to talk about it in whatever way they could. But but I agree with you. I think that's really like such an astute observation that he was looking to connect with us in some way.
The common humanity too. So your story, I'm sure a lot of people who will listen to this haven't read it yet. Hopefully they pick it up and read it and enjoy it like I did. But
thanks.
For of course, it's a moving story, because there are a lot of points in it that are really quite challenging. You had a tough relationship with your dad. He was physically abusive towards you and your brother growing up. Your mom, you guys kind of felt like was quiet and didn't really defend you maybe as much as you needed at the time. And yet I think what the positive takeaway from the book, and maybe what, I don't know, I would ask, we're talking, so maybe what compelled you to write it, I guess, despite all the challenges, the common humanity that you felt from the classmates you eventually did find, the people who accepted you and took you in, which was your chance skateboarding encounter where you kind of figured it out a little bit, eventually in the classroom too. It seems like that's maybe the undercurrent of your book, that despite all this negative stuff and despite fighting to fit in, eventually you did kind of find it.
Yeah, for sure. And, I think part of it is that, despite all of the challenges, right, that America presents, it is a work in progress. And I think it's still a place where a person can invent, reinvent, and then again, reinvent themselves, right? I mean, like, this is the land of like second, third, and fourth chances. And, I think it's really powerful, and I don't take that lightly. And I don't mean that in a glib way. I think this really is like a place for you to really like be the person that you want to be. It's like there's this like great James Baldwin quote, where he's just like, you can either go out in the world and tell the world how it's going to treat you, or the world can tell you how it's going to treat you, right? And if it's the latter, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. And I totally butchered that James Baldwin quote, but it's a great quote, right? And it's basically like you go out into the world and it's like you can either set the terms in which you're going to interact with the world, right? Sort of like boss moves, or you can just be like, okay, world, like, how many times are you going to punch me in the face today? So I think that's really powerful that because I think like, at least growing up in like Vietnam, like my parents have very strict and rigid expectations, like it's both like a cultural thing and like a religious thing. And there are lots of other places like that, right, where there are these sort of like very strong, and maybe kind of immovable expectations for who you're going to be and what you're going to do, and familial expectations and cultural and societal. And I think like in America, it's a little bit like DIY, right? It's still got this kind of like frontier mentality. So it's like, yeah, you know what I mean? It's just like,
absolutely. That's why do you think you see so many Ford F-150 commercials at your football game? I mean, it's marketing. People like it. I've heard that's the best selling truck in the country. So that's best selling vehicle in the country. So people resonate to it still. Absolutely.
Yeah, and for sure.
Would you say that when you really started to feel that and find that was kind of that late, middle, early high school period when you started skating, when you got into punk? Was that when that really started to crystallize for you?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think like it's this idea of finding community, right? And the idea that like, like when I think about community, I think about like, or finding your crew, right? And it's like finding people who see you, understand you, and value you. And I think like that skateboard crew is really critical. Like I think like they were just like, okay, like all those things, right? Like we see you, we value you, and we understand you, and then connecting with teachers too. Like like I think my teachers were incredible in that way. Like some of my English teachers were just so instrumental in making me feel seen and understood. Yeah. I mean, as a young person, right? Like, I think that's all you want is like, you don't want people to treat you like a douche, right? Like you just are like, just please treat me with a little bit of respect and make me feel like a human being.
With skating, what was the attraction for you with that? Why skating? And then I guess why punk that followed it later?
Yeah. I mean, I think the skating thing, like I just happened to have a skateboard and then like fell in with these kids and it was just fun, right? Like, I mean, skateboarding was just like a little bit dangerous and kind of fun. And when those kids were just like, yeah, come skate with us. And then I immediately, saw that like the rednecks were like being dicks to them too. And then they like totally had my back. I'm like, okay, thank God. Like finally, cause like there were no other like Vietnamese kid, like there wasn't like an Asian kid's table at lunch. You know what I mean? Like I had nobody had my back. And so like, in the 80s, it was just like, there were like kids just got into fist fights all the time. And it didn't really escalate from there, but still like, it sucks getting like your ass kicked. And so like that skate crew, like, I mean, in a very real and way, like it was like, they were the first kids who were like, okay, like we got your back if like you get jumped by like 3 rednecks. I was like, all right, like this is how I'm going to survive high school. And then, like, and I think like as a young adolescent boy, like you just start feeling angry about the world. And like, I was just lucky in that I discovered like punk rock right at that time, which was like the angriest music I'd ever heard. And I was like, all right, I got my theme song. I got my boys. Like, let's go.
That was all you needed to get going.
Yeah, for sure.
See, it's funny because I think someone of my generation, I'm 24. I know when you talk about punk in the book, for example, I know what you're talking about. But I feel like that wasn't really as much of a thing when I was growing up in kind of the mid 2000s, the 2010s. I feel like that kind of, it was something different at that point. Honestly, I don't even really know what it was. I guess it's kind of rap music now.
Yeah, for sure.
A little bit. But I think it's funny though, but I think it speaks to the power of that cultural movement that it still resonates to this day. You can still kind of think about, you know exactly what someone's talking about when they say punk rock.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, I think I would be disappointed if it were still the same thing today. Like I think the idea is that like it needs that counterculture, the culture of rebellion or the culture of like youth culture, like it needs to evolve. It needs to like sort of implode and then reinvent itself. And, like I hope that each generation has a vehicle, an artistic vehicle to be angry through. Right. And I agree with you. Like, I think, hip hop and rap was the voice of protest for a long time. Like just like a plug for this podcast. So there's a great podcast that's the history of The Clash, one of like the first punk bands, and it's done by the BBC, but the whole thing is narrated by Chuck D from Public Enemy. And it's just like amazing. Like, it's just like this great intersection where you're just like he's making all these connections between like hip hop and punk as like the music of like the original music of protest. Right. In an angry way. Like it wasn't like hippie shit, where it's like, oh, like, I'm going to protest the war, but like, I don't want to like punch anybody in the face, whereas like hip hop and punk rock were just like, nope, like we're going to punch you in the face, kind of stuff.
Yeah. I think a lot of people can relate to it. I think, and it's funny too, because I don't know if it was like this when you were in high school, when you were a punk and you had the bleached hair and the shaved side of the head. But I think even the popular kids at schools in a way still relate to it too. Oftentimes those are probably the people who relate to it the most.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And I think I would never like prescribe it for a certain kind of person, like I think that feels really dogmatic and narrow to me. I wish that punk, like, at least ethically, like punk had sort of like this big umbrella idea, right? That like it's like anybody who doesn't fit in, anybody who wants to join can join, but obviously it has sort of like other underlying tensions in it as well. But like hip hop, like I think hip hop is so big now, right? Like I think hip hop might even be a better vehicle for us to talk about that. Like there's nobody that you would be like, oh, you can't listen to hip hop. Like in the 80s, at least, it was a little weird. It was just like, oh, if you were a prep, or if you were a jock, like you can't listen to punk rock, or like you couldn't listen to metal unless you were like a metalhead. And I think music in general and like sort of youth culture in general is much more fluid now, which is great. Like it's amazing, right? Like nobody looks at you if you're just like 1 minute you're like, you know what, I'm going to listen to like some Bob Dylan, and the next minute, you're listening to Kid Cudi or whatever, or yeah.
Is it when you look back on some of these things, right? Because even the early part of the book, like I said, from my perspective at least, the early part of the book is largely characterized by kind of alienation, ostracism, growing increasingly distant from your parents as you really start to become more quote unquote American or assimilate more, and as they kind of struggle to. And the latter part of the book, the second half, the last third, if whatever, however you want to divide it, is characterized by you kind of hitting your stride. Yet even as that started to happen, there were still these moments, right before you graduated, one of the redneck kids that you talk about, I think, did he call you a gook? Is that what he said? I think.
Yeah.
Which you describe, it completely deflated you. It brought you back to earth from feeling like you had finally kind of made it and you were graduating high school and you had survived it. And so when you dredge up these old memories, when you go back through this stuff, how hard is that for you? Like when you were writing this, what was it like to relive all that?
Yeah, I mean, it was, yeah, for sure. I mean, like, thank God I did so much therapy in my 30s, right? Like, I think, I don't think I could have written this book any earlier, like, I think it was, for me, like, I think this book happened at exactly the right time in my life, in that, like, I had done, like, sort of, like, counseling and therapy to work through, like, mostly, like, my relationship with my parents, but also just sort of, like, lots of other, it gave me, like, a toolkit to, sort of process or metabolize, like, sort of all the hard things that happened and try to see like the good in it, or at least to understand it. I mean, it wasn't the worst thing in the world, but I mean, I think the challenge for me was, on like my writing days, like sitting down and sort of like getting into an emotional place so that I could write the stories with a kind of a rawness or a realness, like I didn't want to write it in like a sanitized way, so that it just felt like really distant and safe, like, it's like, even, at the end, it's like 35 years later or whatever. And it's like, I'm about to get into a fight and it's my senior year and I might get kicked out. Like, I want that to feel kind of like immediate and dangerous, and like stupid, like all those things. And, so it was a little bit of it was definitely a little bit of gear grinding for me to like, go out of my whatever 45-year-old body and like sort of trying to inhabit like my 17-year-old self for a minute, or for an afternoon while I was writing, and then like go home and then like parent my kids, so it was like those transitions were tricky, but yeah, I don't think I could have written the book any earlier, just because I just hadn't thought about a lot of that stuff or thought about it in a smart way, or a thoughtful way, until really like my late 30s, when I like was like, I got to do some work on myself before I become a parent. That was like, for me, like becoming like a better person, or like sort of leveling up, was really becoming a parent. Yeah.
There's some really tough stuff in there. I mean, one of the most poignant anecdotes was when you talk about how your uncle had killed himself and his wife. And what was really fascinating about that story, other than the obvious tragedy of it, was just that the way you describe how to you guys, he was the paragon of assimilation, and he was the most American family member. And he'd married, I think, a white American woman, and his kids were American, and somehow even he hadn't been able to escape the trauma.
Yeah. And that was, really, for me, like that was the big takeaway for me. I was like, God, how did you screw that up? Like you got the golden ticket, and somehow like you messed it up. And it didn't make any sense to me, because like it seemed like, and it was also like the 70s and the 80s, where, we didn't, like, at least in American popular culture, there wasn't this idea of like celebrate diversity or whatever. Like, there were like cartoons about like America being like the great melting pot. Like, I don't know if you were familiar with that phrase, but like, sort of, yeah, it was this idea of like, oh, if you just come to America and like shed all of the vestiges of your old country and adopt our language and our customs, like you are a number one grade A American, and like that's it. Like we'll treat you like an American. And so like my parents and my uncle and everybody were like, okay, like, this idea of assimilation was like very real. And my parents, they were like, yeah, you need to assimilate, and then,
right.
Which is
even as they, it seems like, I guess maybe they tried to, but it was harder for them, obviously. So you felt like they were pushing you in that direction?
Oh yeah. Oh, without a doubt. Oh, without a doubt. Yeah. They were just like, their dream was, they were just like so happy that like my brother and I were like speaking, good English and like didn't have an accent. They were like, oh, you guys got it made, like they, yeah, for sure. And I think they still believe that, really, like that, that assimilate, like if you ask them if they feel like they're American, they would be like, yeah, we're American. Yeah. It's very interesting.
Are you close with them now after all the, I guess I'm curious, have any of your family members read the book?
Yeah, my brother has, and he, he's a lawyer. So and he, said, he was the person about whom I was most nervous, because like, our overlap in experiences is sort of like the most, the widest. Right. And, so I was worried that he was like going to call bullshit on one thing or another, but no, he texted me and he was like, dude, you really captured like growing up in our town and the dysfunction of our family. So that felt really affirming to me. Also he is a lawyer. So I was like, please don't sue me,
I think you described one episode where you kind of, as the older brother, relented and took him with your friends when you went to egg houses. So
yeah.
I think the statute of limitations on that is probably.
Yeah, definitely.
You're probably in the clear.
Yeah, for sure.
He didn't see it though before you published it. Like he had no idea really nothing.
Yeah, nothing. Yeah.
And he figures prominently. He's a really important figure in the book.
Yeah, he is. I mean, and like he's a child through the book, and through my eyes, like he's not really like a fully formed person, but like he was the person that I felt like I had to protect the most. And yeah. My cousins, I have like contemporary cousins who read it and they really enjoyed it. And a few of my aunts have read it, I think. I mean, it's written in a way that it can be a little bit of a challenge for people who aren't like, English isn't their first language. My parents apparently have not read it. So, my mother is functionally illiterate. And my dad's English is good, but I don't know if he could sort of stomach it. Like, I think it would be painful for him to read.
Really?
Because I think he would miss the nuances of it. Like, I don't know if this is your takeaway, but it certainly was not my intention. Like I really wanted to portray them as complex people, right? Like, and they're not like two-dimensional monsters. I think I want to be able to say two sort of paradoxical things, right? That like they experienced incredible trauma and sacrificed a lot to do things for our family. And they were sometimes like shitty parents, right? And like those two things can both be true at the same time. Yeah.
I definitely took that away. There were two particular parts. One of them was double-edged, but there were two particular parts of the book that stuck out to me in that regard. One was the stereo that your parents had gotten you, and you were very clear that you say, I wasn't grateful enough to them. I was mad at them, and I wasn't able to express to them how much this meant to me. That they knew that this was the perfect gift for me because this was when you were really getting into music. Yeah. And later, of course, your dad smashed it, and that's kind of a fitting microcosm of your childhood.
Yeah.
But then there was one particular part right at the end of the book, though, where I wrote it down actually, where you talk about how your parents exchanged their dreams for their children's, and how they had lost and left behind so much for you guys to have something more. And when you were going to college, you talk about that, right?
Yeah.
You were desperate to leave Carlisle. You got into NYU, and unfortunately were not able to go, but you went to Bard.
Yep.
And how your parents had kind of mortgaged everything they had for that moment.
For sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
That definitely. Yeah. But it's funny though, because you and I were talking about this a little bit off camera. It came through to me, certainly, and I think you made a clear effort to make sure that was in there. Yet the New York Times wrote up your book, and it seems like the nuance of that was really lost on the guy who wrote it up. I don't know much about him. I don't know who he is or his experience, but he seemed to really take issue with the whole book. I mean, even it was funny though, because what he clearly took issue with was your characterization of your experience as an immigrant, a Vietnamese Asian immigrant. But he even talked about how you kind of missed the mark on literature and punk rock, which I'm sure that to you was even more offensive.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just not sure. Yeah, I don't know what the space was he was in when he was writing it, like, and he's, like, I looked him up, and it's like he's Korean American. Like, I don't know, if he grew up in the West Coast. It's just sort of like, this is my experience growing up as like first gen refugee in a small white town with no other Asian people around me, and so, like, obviously, like, if you grew up in Koreatown in LA, third generation Korean, and you go to like a fancy college and all this other, or a private high school, like, like, of course my experience is going to feel very foreign to you, because, but I'm not sure, I guess it didn't feel like a review. Like, it didn't feel like, like it, like, it was critical, like, or it was critical of me and my take on stuff. But, like, like, as far as the writing goes, like, I just didn't, yeah, I mean, I just feel like he missed the mark. But I don't know, like, I mean, like, what's really interesting, I think, in general with books, right, is you know it's a little bit of a Rorschach test, right, and that, like, people are going to get what they bring to it, so it's like, I don't know what baggage, or what, not baggage, but, sort of, I don't know what he or any reader, frankly, is bringing to it, right. And that's true when you make any kind of piece of art, right, like, you cannot control how people are going to interpret it. Like, all you can do is, you do your best in making sure that your message and the thing that you want to convey is crystal clear. Like, this sort of like ambiguous, work is not great, right? Like, so, like, I didn't want the work to be, complex. Yes, I did want it to be complicated, but I didn't want it to be ambiguous. So I'm not sure what happened there. I mean, and for what it's worth, like, I think, if you look at, like, sort of like review aggregators, like, the Times is like the only review that was like a pan. Like, every other review has been like, a good or rave review. So it feels like it's now, they're like kind of this like statistical outlier.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's yeah, I don't know. I'm curious, like, was your take just like, man, this guy, like, I didn't read the same book this guy read, or whatever, like.
Well, like I mentioned to you earlier, when I first read the review, I read it kind of randomly, and I hadn't read the book yet, so I didn't have a frame of reference or anything. But it was actually almost even more so not having read the book. It felt really harsh, and not having read the book, it kind of struck me that from a distance, I felt like this guy was trying to basically say your interpretation of your experience was wrong.
Yeah.
Which seemed like kind of a difficult position to defend to me. It seemed kind of hard to me to say to someone, the way you contextualize and view your experience is wrong. And especially when you look, I can understand why, even when you see unfortunately, there's certain things that are just buzzwords, right? When you see a review about a book written by a guy who immigrated here from Vietnam, and you see the word assimilationism or assimilation, you can kind of immediately guess it's going to take either a hard stance one way or the other. And this was just one side of that. So that was kind of my first takeaway. When I actually read the book, I thought, okay, I can understand why this guy felt this way, even though I don't agree with it. I came away saying, even so, this guy kind of missed the nuance. And it's kind of hard to say to someone, no. The way you dealt with your parents' trauma and your problem with your parents, and people calling you a gook and other slurs, and the way you look, to say that to the person, the way you dealt with that, you were wrong about it. You shouldn't have done it like that.
Yeah. I don't know what to say to that. I mean, like, again, that doesn't feel like a literary critique, right? Like, it feels so it feels personal. Like, it definitely felt like a personal attack. And I'm just like, I don't know, man. I don't, yeah.
It didn't bother you? You were able to brush it off pretty easily?
No, it bothered me a lot, actually. But I mean, I think, like, it did bother me, and like, I think the way that I sort of reframed it for myself, which was like, okay, I guess that makes sense, is there have been a couple of things like that people have written. And I think, like, no one can really prepare you for putting something so personal out there, and something that you feel really proud of, and then, like, having people, like, really just, like, wail on it like a piñata. Some people, right? Not everybody. I mean, and people, often, so it's like, anyway, so I think, like, the way that I've reframed it for myself is, I think about, like, cooking for myself, right? It's like, if I cook for myself and I'm making this, dish, and, like, I'm gonna spice it up, like, I'm gonna spice it up to my spice level, and then I'm gonna serve it to Jake, and then Jake's gonna be like, whoa, too spicy, like, I can't eat that. And, like, yeah, that's totally fair, right? Like, and And so I feel like those, like the critical reception where it's been like that, like I'm just like, yeah, too spicy. Like I get it. Or, I didn't cook it for you. Right. Like at the end of the day, like I feel super proud of the book. And I think if people vibe with it, like that's great. And if they don't, like, that's okay. Like that's why there's, a million books for people to read, because like, I think one of the things that one of my guiding sort of principles as I was writing was this thing that I read in E.B. White's Elements of Style. He said, at the end of the day, you're writing for an audience of one. Like you're writing for yourself, and you've got to be happy and be pleased with what you're putting out there. Like don't chase trends. Like don't try to write whatever is topical. Like just, write your truth. And and that was, he wrote that like a long time ago, but I read that and I was like, that seems really valid, right? Like that's going to lead me to a place where when I ask myself, like, is this a book that only I could have written? And if the answer is yes, then I think I did the job that I set out to do. So,
well, it certainly is.
Thanks. Yeah.
It's funny. I was talking with someone about this yesterday, but it's in the internet world, especially, right? As soon as you see one thing written online, it has this weird power. You can know as much as you want, and you can remind yourself that's just some random idiot who's anonymous and hiding behind a keyboard, and they would never really say to me if they actually met me and knew I was a real person. But it's still, when you see something written, especially and in the New York Times, no less.
Yeah.
That's not just the YouTube comments or
yeah, it's pretty savage. Yeah. It's tough. It's like I was talking to a friend of mine who's a filmmaker, and she was talking about like, her talking about a film that she made, and sort of it also getting panned by the Times, like on the day that it was being released. And it's like I think it's also like you sign up for it. Like I now I'm better equipped and I understand like like it is what it is, and you do the best job you can. And and I also don't know like what I mean, honestly, like I'm not being glib about this, like I don't know what kind of week or a day or a month that guy had. Like maybe he just had like a really rough month, like I'm trying to find that like space of empathy to understand why someone would write something like that, and yeah, who knows. Yeah.
when the book ends, you've just graduated high school and you're going off to Bard. As we just discovered, you actually had the same teachers I did at Bard, and Bard, your classics education at Bard is actually the basis of your TED Talk. So when you got to Bard, right, you were really sure you were going to major in English and art. And as you started to realize that, how did you come to the realization you weren't going to do it? And what was it like then to pivot to classics, which admittedly is an esoteric discipline, right? I mean, when I did it in Phuc, I think there were 8 or 9 kids in the major my year, and then at Harvard it was 11 or 12. So it's small.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I I think a couple of things. Like when I went off to Bard, like just college, like I like a few things, right? Like I was still very immature, right? Like you're like you think about like what you think as a 17-year-old, as like a high school senior, like you think everything, and like and then. Yeah, and then in retrospect, you're like, God, I didn't know shit, But anyways, like like as you're heading off, it's like everything that was like bad, I just assigned to Carlisle. Like I was like, oh, like racism, like that's Carlisle. It's like if I moved to New York City, like there's no racism in New York City. It's like a big city. Everybody lives together. Like again, sort of like my naive 17-year-old self. So. Like I had built up, I think, college to be something that it could not have been, right? Like there's no way that any college could have lived up to what I thought it was going to be, just because like I like sort of felt so much antipathy for Carlisle. So when I got to Bard, I just wasn't connecting with the kids in the class. I mean, the teachers were great, but like the kids were all like, they were skipping class. Like they would show up and like, they didn't read the books. I was like, what the hell, guys? Like, we're here to learn. Like you're paying like, thousands of dollars, like, for every class. Like, and so that felt really disappointing to me. And then, so then I was like, well, by like November, I was like, I'm done. I'm not majoring in English or art. And it was true for my art class as well, where like these kids like couldn't draw. And like, I was like, what the hell? And, I was sitting at lunch in November and I heard this kid say, he was sitting at my table and he's like, I'm taking ancient Greek. It's the hardest thing I've ever studied. And I immediately was like, what? You know, like, cause like, I'm just like naturally oppositional, I guess. I was like, I want to take that. Like, you know, like, you know, it's sort of like, you know, you, yeah, it's like, I'm going to find the biggest guy and I'm going to fight that guy, you know, like, so I heard ancient Greek was the hardest thing this kid had ever done. So I was like, all right, I'm down. Like, I'm going to check this out. So yeah, I took Greek with Professor Keller. Yeah. Drew Keller. And
I still, I don't know if, well, you're closer to his age than I am, but when you graduate collegiate, I guess for anyone who's not listening, for anyone who listens to this and doesn't know about collegiate, a lot of them are my friends, my parents, and my parents' friends. So, but you know, if who doesn't know collegiate, it's a formal school. You Mr., Mrs., Doctor, a lot of PhDs. And when you graduate, they tell you that you can now call the teachers, some of whom you've known for 13 years, 12 years, 10 years, 8 years, by their first names. To this day, I have never done that once. Yeah. The thought of calling Dr. Keller Drew horrifies me.
Oh, that's funny.
I'll send this to him, but yeah. It's so uncomfortable.
It's so funny. So when he was at Bard, he hadn't finished his PhD at Princeton. Yeah, he was like he was either ABD or about to defend it or something. Yeah, so he was just like adjunct at Bard, and he and I really connected. Like, I mean, like you know, he's probably, you know, he's like one of the best teachers I've ever had. You know, like and then it turned out right. So Dr. Russell taught, you know, Drew.
Yes.
So it was really funny, you know, so like, I like to joke, you know, it's like I'm like the Aristotle to his Plato, and, you know, she's like Socrates. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That's fitting. Although you taught it before he did.
That's true. No, it's true. Yeah. But it's just in terms of lineage, you know, like who learned from whom. Yeah, for sure.
It's a good lineage. Yeah. I mean, for people who don't know them, it's hard to, they're the reason I ended up studying classics and kept with it for high school and college too. I mean, they're, to your point earlier about great teachers, I mean, those are legends. The best you could ever have.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, like, and you think about like Dr. Russell, you know, like it's you know, what's really funny is, so I did the Institute. So I learned Greek. I learned everything out of order. I learned Greek first, and then I learned Sanskrit.
You learned Greek
finally,
first?
Yeah. Like I'd done nothing, and then I hit Greek, and I was like, holy smoke. Like, you know, having done no foreign languages, and then you hit Greek, you're just like, I got crushed, and I worked so hard. And then I did Sanskrit. And so by the time I did Latin, I was like, Latin is easy, you know, like compared to those two things. And I remember meeting Stephanie. I did the Latin Institute, and I remember meeting Dr. Russell. She like just came by the Institute because Drew had told her. He was like, there's this hot shit kid in my class. His name is Phuc. You should come by and meet him. And I was like, hey, what's up? You know, yeah, it was just so wild. Yeah. It's a small world. I mean, that world of like Latin teachers, especially like New York City Latin teachers, is like very small.
Well, even more so when I got to Harvard and I saw their textbook, they wrote this textbook. When I saw their textbook that we had used in 8th grade in a Harvard classroom, and I asked my professor, who's R.J. Tarrant, if you know him. I mean, he's a well-known classicist. And he said, oh, yeah, I teach that in the summers in intensive Latin. I just thought, oh, well, okay.
Yeah. You're like, I did this in 8th grade, right? Yeah.
No, I just thought to myself, I was lucky to have them. I was lucky to know those people. I mean, again, this is another thing. This is really the insider of insider conversation. It's funny when having done something like this, right? One of my other guests was Dr. Adam Bresnick from Collegiate. I don't know if you knew him. Awesome guy.
Of course. Yeah.
Beloved guy. And so one of the comments I got, people love that one too, as I'm sure they will this one. But one of the comments I got was, you know, when you started talking Dostoevsky at the end, when you start talking about collegiate, people are you're going to lose people. Like you said about your book, my response to my friend was, well, fuck it. It was fun.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
But so when you start talking Latin and Greek, I mean, that's insider enough. Then you start talking high school Latin and Greek, but
right. And specific people who have been teaching it and all that stuff. Right.
Yeah. It's a very small world, and it's funny when you start getting down that path, but it's funny, right? Because those subjects, I'll tell you this, one of the best ones I ever got was when I was working in finance one summer. I guess maybe this guy very nice guy. Maybe he'd seen my resume, or maybe, I don't know how he knew who I was or anything, because I never dealt with him, but he said to me, Jake Levine, aren't you the guy who speaks Japanese? And I said, I just Spanish, Greek, and Latin. So I just said, yeah. I just said, that's me. That's me. Thankfully, he didn't ask me to recite anything.
That's great.
And when I went to Japan last year, I found out really how little Japanese I did know. That was talk about an experience of realizing you don't fit in.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah.
But also faking it till you make it, right?
I tried. I mean, for a while I didn't jaywalk out of respect for the culture, and they're really anti. But at a certain point, on my 6th day in Tokyo, I just thought, I can't do this anymore. I started aggressively jaywalking. Yeah. Yeah. Now, so to switch gears a little bit, right?
Sure.
I think another one of the things you're known for largely is your tattoo shop.
Mm.
And one of the first things I had heard about you actually was that when you were a collegiate, is this true that you were required to wear long sleeves?
No, I wasn't required. I just chose to wear long sleeves.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, I mean, but collegiate does require, it doesn't.
Well, in the winter, you're supposed to wear a shirt and tie.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So I just figured like that was just an easy way to, cover up. And I wasn't like I feel like, I mean, teenage boys are very distractible, and like in the classroom, like I really wanted to just be like, I'm going to talk about the subjunctive today, or I'm talking about the ablative today, or whatever. And like I just didn't want the conversation to all of a sudden like veer into like tattoos and tattooing, and also like I think and it's not even like the kids. Like I also worry about like what, like it really only takes like one set of parents to be like, that guy's not going to teach my kids. Like he looks like a scumbag, or whatever. I mean, and I think it's probably different now, but I started teaching at collegiate in 99, I think.
Is that something you thought would happen?
No, 98. Sorry. Yeah.
I was too. Is that something you thought would happen though? Did you think that a parent, like parent teacher conferences or whatever, parent teacher night, they see your tattoos? And
I just, like, I think having, I also didn't think that like being Asian was going to affect my college, admissions interview either, so like, I just didn't want to set myself up to being naive. So in some ways I think it was like just being protective, it's like I just wanted to make sure that if people were going to have a conversation about my work as a teacher and my pedagogy, like it was about what I was doing in the classroom and not like how I looked or like my tattoos or what I was doing after school or on the weekends or whatever. Because, like I think, so like I just wanted to streamline that conversation a little bit, and for kids too. Like and I think up until last year, I mean, I've never taught in short sleeves or like sort of shown my tattoos at school. I just just for myself and my own sanity, I guess. I mean, kids knew, and like they sort of would whisper, and then they would ask me, and I would lie, just like, no, I don't know what you're talking about.
As the kind of peeking
exactly. It just deepens the mystery. I remember one year some kids started a rumor. I don't know if it was a joke or not, but some kids came up to me. They're like, Mr. Tran, we heard that you go to Thailand and fight Muay Thai in the summer. Is that true? And I started cracking up, and then I looked at him and I was like, I can't confirm or deny that. Who told you? And I just laughed.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I guess. Well, you're not wrong. At collegiate, anything can. They're always weird rumors and things like that. I mean,
for sure.
Yeah. So when did you get into doing tattoos yourself? Because you have a shop, right? Tsunami?
Yeah. I own a shop in Portland, Maine. Yep, you got it. Thanks.
When
for the
did
shout
you
out.
start doing that? Of course.
Yeah, so I was in my last month of graduate school in 1997, and I had applied for a tattoo apprenticeship. So I was getting tattooed by this guy in New York City. I was going to grad school in Massachusetts at Amherst, UMass Amherst, and this guy, the guy who was tattooing me was a friend of mine, and he just said, "Hey, we're looking for an apprentice. Like, you should apply." And so I just thought, "Oh, sure, why not? Like, what am I doing?" Like, so I applied for the apprenticeship, and then like 2 weeks later, like they called me up. This was like pre-internet, so like I put like 12 drawings in an envelope and like mailed it to them. And like 2 weeks later, they called me and they're like, "Yeah, your stuff looks good. If you want to move to New York City, we'll teach you how to be a tattooer." And I was like, "Fuck yeah!" Like packed up my Honda Accord and moved to Jersey City. Like I got this like $300 apartment in Jersey City, and yeah.
So were you doing that? Were you doing that professionally before you were actually teaching?
It was simultaneous. So yeah. So I guess that's not true. Like, so I got my very first teaching job at St. Peter's Prep, and that first year I was apprenticing at night, like learning how to tattoo. And then that lasted a year. My apprenticeship lasted a year, and then after that, I went to collegiate, and then I was tattooing full time. And when I first came to collegiate, I was just part time. Like they think they had like three Latin classes or 2 Latin classes.
Yeah.
So like it worked out fine. Like I just would show up, teach 3 classes, and then go to the tattoo shop, and then just like zap tattoos, and then yeah, it was pretty chill. And then the next year I was like full time, and then I was like full time at collegiate until 2003.
Yeah. What drew you to it? What made that? I guess you had experience with art, but what made that an art form that you got interested in?
I mean, I was always, the punk rock and skateboarding scene was always like deeply sort of like, connected or engraved by tattooing. Like I just never had the money, it was like expensive and like I knew enough to know that like the guys who were doing tattoos in Pennsylvania were not doing good tattoos, but like it was also like, in the 80s, like it didn't matter if you had good tattoos, like you were just a badass if you had like a tattoo, whether it was shitty or not, didn't matter. But like I remember even then being like, I don't know, guys. Like, if I have to choose between like a shitty tattoo and no tattoo, I think I'm just gonna pick no tattoo. Like, I just knew that I wanted to wait, and also I didn't have any money. And then eventually, I discovered the cash advance when I was in college. Yeah, like I was like, oh shit, I have a credit card. I can like advance myself $300. So like it's like a ridiculous interest rate, but I didn't know anything about that either. So I just like got like $300 in cash and like got tattooed in college, and yeah. So it was a long time coming. I just didn't really sort of have like the means to do it. But yeah.
I guess I want to ask you just one more question.
No,
so
please.
It's hard to tie. Our conversation is pretty wide ranging, so it's hard to tie something like this up neatly.
Sure.
But when, like I said, one of the first kind of ways I knew who you were was that you wrote this article in my high school, again, the newspaper, the Collegiate Journal, and it was called "An Entomologist and an Etymologist Walk into a Bar," and it started with Vladimir Nabokov, the author who also had a passion for entomology, studying bugs. He collected butterflies. He writes about it in his autobiography, Speak Memory. So when you think about identity, right? Your identity and just identity more generally, it seems like that is the essential unifying factor of all your work, of the book, of the TED Talk, of that article. How do you look at these days all the various parts of your identity and how they fit together? Because I think a lot of people I think struggle with, am I this but I'm also that? Am I one or the other? Or where do these? I think a lot of people struggle with contradictory things. I think a lot of people say, well, I really love to read the Iliad, but then I like the Kardashians. So what does that mean? How do you, I guess, reconcile all the facets of your identity?
Yeah, I don't think I think that's so smart, Jake. And I think there's like a lot of pressure in our culture to make everything fit together at right angles. And like and the punk rock part of me is like, no, like I want things to be jagged. Like I want things to not make sense. Like I don't like, not everything has to be coplanar, and I totally think you're right. Like if you want to geek out on, dactylic hexameter and, the Real Housewives, great. Like that, to me, like that deepens your complexity, frankly, like the paradox of it. Right. I think about like, the Walt Whitman quote, about like, I'm large, right? I contain multitudes. And the line before that, he says, do I contradict myself? Then I contradict myself. Right. Like, and I think especially in this political age, right? Like where we are constantly looking, it's like sort of like gotcha politics, right? Like we dig up old tweets and we look for people's like, an article or, legislation that people have passed from like 15, 20 years ago. And they're like, aha, I found this tweet, or I found this like law that you voted for. And now I know you're racist. And it's like, well, in a span of like 15 to 20 years, like, can we allow people to be paradoxical, or even better, allow people to grow, right? Like, and like I think we just want the singular narrative about each other and about ourselves. Like I think because it's convenient, right? It fits into a tweet and all that stuff. And I really want to blow that up as much as possible, or at least to invite people to think about their own complexity, like, because I certainly wanted to lay out my childhood in as messy a way as possible, because it doesn't all fit in together, right? And it is complicated and it is paradoxical, and I think that's okay, right? Like I think that is that adds to the richness of who we are, and yeah. So I think you're right. Like I think I'm constantly thinking about identity, but I'm not trying to sort of have it be reductive or have it like add up to like a nice, neat, sort of like equation or anything like that. I think I'm trying to break the binary, right? Of like, sometimes like 1 + 1 = 3, and that doesn't make any sense, and that's okay.
Well, thanks so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Jake. It was really great talking to you.